This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Ora Szekely. She's been doing a lot of research into the role of female fighters within irregular warfare, so guerrilla fighters, insurgents, that kind of thing. Along with two of her colleagues, she's writing a book about all of this. It's going to be out next year. So Ora is going to be talking about female fighters and their role in conflict, all the way from Colombia to Kurdistan to Palestine. To support Popular Front, go to patreon.com/popularfront and do check out youtube.com/popularfront. Our first documentary is up there now. It's called Bogside Bonfire. It's about Derry, the IRA and nationalist flag burning. This episode is sponsored by thedefensepost.com. So you're writing this book at the moment, right, about female militants within, kind of insurgent groups and what have you. Can you talk about that a little bit? What's going on with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is a co-authored book. It's for a short book series that Georgetown University Press puts together. And I'm writing it with two of my buddies, Alexis Henshaw, who's at Troy, and Jessica Trisco-Darden, who is at American and also at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. So one of the things about being an area specialist, which I am, I spend most of my waking hours thinking about things that go boom in the Middle East, is that I pretty much just think about the Middle East. And so it's been really fun about this project is I've gotten to learn a whole lot that I did not know before about the FARC, which is what Alexis works on, and about the civil war in Ukraine, which is Jessica's area of expertise. So it's been a lot of fun learning about the multiple dimensions of women's participation in armed conflict in some contexts that I don't usually focus on all that much. And one of the things that's really come out of the process of writing this book together is the commonalities across these three really different contexts in terms of women's involvement in these armed groups. Yeah, well,
maybe let's talk about them, because we'll get into the Middle East, because obviously the YPJ, the female wing of the Kurdish militias in northern Syria, everybody knows about them, But like you said then, you were surprised to find out about these other women in these kind of forces. Can you talk about them?
The first place to start, I think, one of the things that's really come out of the process of working on this book is that I think one of the big blind spots in security studies and the study of armed conflict in general, and especially the study of asymmetric conflict, right? So civil wars, rebellions, terrorist campaigns, so on and so forth, is that when we say combatant, what we usually mean is men. And when we're going to talk about women combatants, we say women, right? We say female fighters when we mean women, and when we're talking about male fighters, we just say fighters, right? So there's this understanding that female combatants are this like special, exceptional class that are really an exception to the rule. But one of the things that's come out of the conversations that Jess and Alexis and I have had with each other over the course of writing this book, and a lot of the writing and research that we've done for it, is that really asymmetric warfare pretty much always involves women, just as it pretty much always involves men. And the variation really occurs in the nature of women's participation. So there are a couple of big, broad trends that we can identify. And this isn't just us. This is research that a lot of other people have done on the nature of women's participation in asymmetric warfare. So one of the big commonalities is that the top-down side of the equation, right, like what the organizations themselves are like, what their internal policies are like, matters up to a point. So ideology is kind of important. Statistically speaking, leftist groups are much more likely to recruit women. Islamist groups are somewhat less likely to recruit women, and nationalism, so those sort of like bog standard, like separatist nationalist groups that are less ideologically oriented, that doesn't seem to have a super strong effect on whether or not they're going to recruit women. So that's one common theme. Another common theme, and this is why I think the treating female combatants as this like weird occasional thing that only happens sometimes, that's an exception, that's not part of the mainline story of warfare, is kind of problematic, is that it turns out that female fighters join militant groups for the same reasons that male fighters do. And this like maybe shouldn't be so surprising to us, right? People, including men, including women, tend to pick up guns for a wide range of reasons. Some of those reasons are about political grievance. So people who have experience of state repression, people who have experienced state violence, people who have seen bad things happen to their friends, family at the hands of the state are more likely to develop, a sense that they would like to do something about that, right? So that's one incentive that seems to lead women into joining armed groups. Some of this is abstract, some of it is personal, right? So people can also become motivated to join an armed group without having experienced personal first-person experience of state repression. It can, for some people, be purely ideological. For other people, it's about something that actually happened to them in their lives. But one thing that also seems to be the case across a number of different armed groups is that women will sometimes have this added set of motivations which are about their own personal lives. So one of the things that Alexis has found is that women who join the FARC were sometimes motivated to do so, at least in part, because they were trying to escape violence at home.
The FARC being the Colombian rebels, right?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. So in Colombia, some of the women who are choosing to join the FARC or the ELN, which is a smaller Colombian rebel group that's sort of runs parallel to the FARC, they were sometimes motivated to do so because they were trying to escape violence at home, maybe from like an abusive partner or from parents. Another set of motivations seem to relate to trying to escape from early marriage. So one of the things that some Kurdish fighters will say when interviewed, although my interview subjects did not list this as a motivation, but it's certainly there in other testimonies, is that young women will sort of see themselves as having two possible choices. They could get married in like their mid to late teens, or they could go off and join the PKK. Like this is something that seems to happen in rural areas of Turkey. So there can also be these sort of like very personal motivations where women who are trying to escape a difficult situation will look at joining an armed group as a way of doing that. And sometimes it can also be just like a broader interest in more personal autonomy, right? This is something that I heard from women that I talked to who'd been involved with the PKK in Turkey, which is that they didn't just, and you see this in testimonies by current and former fighters all the time. You also hear this from women who fight with YPJ, that they're not just interested in fighting the Turkish state. They're not just interested in fighting against ISIS. They also see themselves as fighting against misogyny. They're interested in liberating themselves as Kurds, but they're also interested in liberating themselves as women. So one theme that comes out of that is this sense of there being kind of a double struggle. So women are not only facing the same state repression that their male comrades are facing, they also find themselves pushing for more autonomy, pushing for more recognition of their talents, pushing for a more egalitarian culture within their own organizations.
Yeah, I was in Diyarbakir in 2015 in Sur, the neighborhood where all the fighting was happening between the PKK youth and the Turkish military. And I met a female commander there, a PKK female commander. And she was like YDGK, they were calling it. Yeah. It was like, the female wing of the PKK youth. Anyway, and she said exactly that, she was very talkative and she was very like wanting to tell you all of what she's fighting for. And she was saying, yes, we're fighting, against the Turkish state oppression. We're fighting for our own land, but also I'm fighting for every woman on earth, like it was a very deep ideological thing she had, it was very interesting. Yeah,
it is really interesting. And I think that's much more explicit in the PKK and the YPJ and these sort of like all of the organizations within this like broader constellation of interconnected organizations. whose connections are stronger at some points, weaker at others, right? So that's maybe more common as a narrative within those organizations than it is in other organizations. But I do think there's something to this idea that women in these armed groups, even in groups that are ideologically committed, at least in theory, to egalitarianism, that there's probably some work that they find themselves doing within the organizations to try and create more equality on the ground, as it were.
Well, that's what I really liked about genealogy, the female ideology that the PKK follow and the YPG and the YPJ, because it wasn't like this kind of Western thing of like, yeah, fuck men. It was like, no, we need each other, and without us here, you can't be whole, and you can't learn off of each other. And I thought that was a really nice way of doing it, and especially, in terms of the battlefield, it actually proved to be very effective, because some of the female fighters were a lot better at certain types of combat than the male fighters, for example, snipers.
As a committed feminist, I'm gonna say that I see feminism as being about a lot of other ideas. But
no, absolutely. But I mean, it's become like a trend. It's like a thing that people just say, and it's like, no, there's a lot more to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's certainly. I think part of the reason why genealogy one thing that I heard from some Kurdish women activists that I talked to in Turkey a couple of years ago, who are not part of the armed wing of any party, they're like civilian activists, but who are deeply engaged with this like broader liberationist political project. When I talked to them about, how do you see, I think I used the word feminism like through an interpreter when I was talking to them about this, and they were really quick to say like, well, actually, we feel as if Western feminism doesn't really speak to us, in part because it's sort of a colonial feminism, that it's feminism for white people, that it misses a lot of these other power dynamics, and that genealogy is something that reflects the realities that we live with, and that it's an ideology that works really well for the Kurdish context. And I thought that was really, really interesting.
A friend of mine, she's one of the kind of genealogy educators in Europe, and she says they come up against a lot of trouble with other feminist groups and trans groups and other LGBT groups, because of their way of doing things is very different to the Western kind of way of doing things. I mean, there's a bit of a conflict there, I think, in some ways.
I think the questions that they start with are a little bit different, because I think the Kurdish experience has been so shaped by the particular struggles against the Turkish state. So I think it's understandable that the internal conversations that they're having are about the issues that are that feel most powerful for Kurdish women. But I will say, I saw Ilham Ahmed, who is or was, I think there's been an election since then, but one of the co-leaders of one of the Kurdish party organs within the SDF. She came to speak in Providence, Rhode Island, which is where I live, about a year and a half ago, and I went to see her, and it was a really, really interesting talk. And afterwards, the audience were all asking questions, and somebody asked, like, hey, how would you feel if a trans woman wanted to join the YPJ and fight as a woman? And without batting an eyelash, Ilham Ahmed's response was, well, of course.
I think the whole project that they're doing there is incredible, especially when you consider the space where it has happened, because no matter how kind of accepting people want to be, the Middle East has famously not been a place where women, are allowed this kind of autonomy. So I think what they're doing is very interesting, especially in terms of, like you said, mixing it up with the kind of Western stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I will tell you my own personal radioactive research spider story, which is how I got interested in doing all this stuff in the first place. Because my previous research had been almost entirely on foreign and domestic policy making among the various Palestinian armed factions, so the leftist, nationalist, Islamist, as well as this whole range of different Lebanese parties. And when I was doing my dissertation research and on sort of subsequent research trips the Middle East, I spent a lot of time like sitting in political party offices and various faction offices in refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and, all over the place. And almost invariably, there were some exceptions, but almost every single time, it was me and a bunch of guys. And occasionally there would be, like somebody's aunt who was making the tea. And that was about it. And look, they were, across the board, incredibly friendly, incredibly hospitable. They would like send somebody out to get me cookies, right? So, I don't want to contribute to this trope that, it must be so hard to be a woman doing research in the Middle East. I actually think it's probably a lot easier in many ways for women, for female researchers to do this kind of work than it is for men. But it was definitely an ongoing characteristic of my research life, shall we say. And then a couple years ago, because academics are really bad at going on vacation, I was in Turkey for a conference and decided I was going to go to Diyarbakir for the weekend just for fun because I wanted to see it. Thought, this would be sort of a nice break. It was during the peace process, and I'd heard really good things about it. And I flew out there from Istanbul, and one of our graduate students at my university had put me in touch with some of his friends. And the next thing I knew, they'd like taken me along with them. They were journalists, and one of them had taken me along with her to this PKK march that she was covering, which, you're an academic. This is great if you like randomly luck into a protest. And one of the things that really struck me was there were women leading the march. There were women on the like political party bus at the front of the march. There were women giving the speeches. And then later on, was, somebody had arranged like some meetings with me for some of the civilian politicians in town. And again, there were, like women running around the offices with like clipboards and cell phones glued to their faces. And it was so different from a lot of what I had seen, even from like far left political parties in other parts of the region, which politically have this like very egalitarian political project, but in practice, like there just isn't, in terms of what the daily work within the faction looks like, they just don't look that way. And I found this really, really fascinating. And I also thought like, this might be kind of a nice break.
Sit with all these guys in offices.
Right. Who again, I don't want to complain about any of the folks that who were kind enough to sit down with me for interviews. They were by and large incredibly kind, incredibly accommodating. But it was such a striking contrast to see what sort of like the internal dynamics of these Kurdish political parties and of the Kurdish national movement more generally, at least in the Turkish context, looked like, that I found myself really fascinated as to like, how did this happen? How did this particular political movement end up looking like this when other organizations elsewhere in the regions just don't?
Yeah, it's very interesting. For all their faults, the PKK's female, inclusion and, empowerment is actually very real. Sometimes you'll see like Peshmerga in Iraq and they'll have like females dressed in uniforms, but they don't let them fight. They don't let them do anything. They just kind of say, come for a photo and that's it. But with the PKK, hate them or love them or whatever, that is actually very real. That's a very real part of it.
One of the things that I find consistently frustrating about coverage of the Middle East in general, like not just the Kurdish parts of the Middle East, is the way that ethnic groups or ethnic is sort of a tricky word to use accurately in the Middle East, but like entire communal groups of hundreds of thousands or like millions of people will be conflated and treated as if they are all politically identical to each other. Right, so the Palestinians want this, or the Lebanese, are such and such way, and that's just not like a terribly useful way to talk about politics. And this happens all the time with the Kurds, and I think it's understandable, right, that this happens in the media, but it's also really not useful. Like treating 30 million people as if they are all politically interchangeable with one another isn't terribly accurate, and it's also not terribly informative. And treating all of the Kurdish political organizations as if they had the same objectives, but also the same like internal organizational characteristics it's just not helpful. But I also understand, right? If you're a producer for a TV show and you've heard like, hey, there's all of this coverage of these female fighters, let's go interview a couple of them. Okay, we could go to northern Syria, which has ISIS running all over the place, or we could go to Diyarbakir, or I guess Kandil, like if you want to go interview actual fighters, which is a war zone, or we could just go to Erbil. Like, I understand why people are like, okay, we'll go to Erbil. Like that seems like I think Erbil sounds fantastic, right?
But this is the problem with news, right? Like modern news is just terrible in that sense. It doesn't actually go into the detail. It's so true, what you said, like, oh, the Kurds. Like which Kurds? Like northern, no, what you mean, like Iran? Or do you mean Turkey? Or do you mean Iraq? Or, what I mean? It's a problem.
Are we talking?
You said your colleague was working on something to do with the female fighters in Ukraine. Now, I've done a lot of work in Ukraine, and I've seen females training and stuff like that, and they do actually, even the fascist groups, they actually hold quite a role, But I've never seen them fighting. Have you experienced any of that with your research in Ukraine?
So we are now veering well outside my area of expertise. So I'm gonna preface anything I might say by saying I might be wrong about this, right? Because this is really this is Jess's area of expertise much more than it is mine. But one of the broad dynamics that she found was that for women who are involved on the sort of the pro-Ukrainian government side, many of them seem to be motivated really heavily by sort of genuine nationalist commitment, which sort of makes sense, right? Because they have to go to the war. They have to make the choice to actually get out there and go to the war. Whereas for women who were on the rebel side, the war came to them. And so, and for them, they are much more specifically driven to actually protect their homes. And so I think that probably shapes some of the differences in participation. But some of it also is, there's some evidence, and I don't know how widespread this is, but that at least some of women's participation is, on both sides, is driven by a shortage of soldiers. But where that gets tricky is that there's also all of this propaganda using female soldiers to attempt to shame men into joining up. Right, so propaganda saying, boy, look at all these female soldiers. Isn't it a shame that there aren't any men to go fight? And we have to have these poor women, who are all fighting, doing a man's job. And I think there's certainly some of that, and that's also not uncommon, right? I mean, that's also a feature of some of the propaganda videos from a bunch of the different factions in Syria. There's a couple of FSA factions that have put out propaganda videos. I saw one when I was doing research for another project a couple of months ago, where the camera is standing on a street and this woman goes booking past holding, I want to say a shoulder mounted RPG. It's just this massive gun, and then she turns and stops and looks at the camera and says, lets off this screed about the terrible repression from the government, and then says, shame on the men of Syria that a woman has to be out here fighting, and then goes running off down the street.
Really not a good message.
Yeah, I mean, it's very direct. So I think there's an element of that, and that's something that you see in a lot of places. Although again, that's definitely not what's happening with the PKK or with the YPJ, and I think that's also not what's happening with the FARC or the EL in Colombia. But it is something that you see in other environments.
And what about the Palestinian factions? Because I know, in the 80s, the PFLP was around. Females definitely, played a large role and a real role as well. Layla Khalid and people like that. But nowadays, you don't really see it, or at least I don't see it, in what I'm looking at. Are they still around, female Palestinian fighters?
So the short answer is the nature of armed resistance in the Palestinian movements has changed a lot over the years, but just because like the military, the forms of engagement have changed a lot. So it's really different. Fighting was basically a land war in Lebanon, and before that in Jordan in 1970, versus fighting what has been an attrition campaign characterized mostly by terrorist tactics that, sometimes, well, when it kills civilians, it's terrorism, and when it kills military personnel, it's guerrilla warfare. But that don't rely as heavily on like huge numbers of fighters, partly because I think a lot of the Palestinian factions don't have huge numbers of fighters, at least not, in numbers that could pose like a real military challenge to the IDF. There have always been women involved, certainly, with the various Palestinian armed groups, but again, not in the way that they were in the PKK, right? I mean, there are estimates, and I think these may be inflated. It's really hard to know, but there are estimates that there are something as many as 40% of the PKK's armed force are women, and there's a big asterisk there, right? So there's some research that's been done recently that suggests that the numbers may be a little bit lower, but still, that's even the lowest estimates put it at like 16 to 18%, which is still north of the number of women in the U.S. military. It's like 16.2. I might have that number wrong, but like even the low estimates of women in fighting with the PKK put those numbers way up there, and that was never the case for even the leftist factions, even like the DFLP. Which is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Like they just never had those sorts of numbers of women fighting with them. They did have women involved in what could be termed like irregular operations. So Leila Khalid is a really good example of that. And Hamas, of course, has recruited women to use as suicide bombers. But that's something the PKK did that as well. Something that I think.
Yeah, I was about to say, famously, that was their thing for a while in the 90s.
Yeah, I think there was one spate where there was in the 90s. I think there were like 15 suicide attacks, 11 of which were carried out by women. I mean, there are a lot of organizations that do this, and it's not hard to see why operationally, right? For a suicide bomber to be effective, they need to be able to get close to the target, and women are often viewed, rightly or wrongly, with less, in this case wrongly, with less suspicion than men might be. But I think that in the Middle East in general, the Kurdish forces really do stand out for the number of women that they use. Because even when the Palestinian forces were engaged in sort of like broad guerrilla warfare with like large numbers of troops, they weren't recruiting women in the same numbers.
Well, I wanted to know what role the female fighters play within FARC and the other Colombian rebels, because that's something I know absolutely nothing about.
Yeah, it's something that I knew very little about before I started working on this book. So thanks, Alexis. I learned a ton from my friend and colleague. So as it turns out, so when I first started working on this question of like why, how did the PKK end up recruiting so many women? One of the things that I kept hearing from people was you need to go out and learn something about the FARC, because the FARC, in fact, in some ways looks pretty similar to the PKK. The estimates are something like 30 to 40%. Of the fighters in the FARC are women, and it's about 25% in the ELN. And there's some other parallels too, right? They're both Marxist organizations. They both embrace this range of broadly egalitarian and liberationist ideas, particularly rights for indigenous people. But more recently, they've also embraced LGBT rights, so on and so forth, right? So there's some interesting parallels there with the Kurdish left organizations and with militant left groups around the world more broadly. But there's another interesting parallel, which I find really fascinating with the PKK, which is this kind of change from within story. So in Kurdistan, in Turkish Kurdistan, in the 1980s and 1990s, there's this like massive crackdown by the Turkish state. and I realize I'm talking about the FARC by talking about the Kurds, but there is a point to all of this, I promise. So there's this massive crackdown on the Kurdish population by the Turkish military and security forces. And this produces a certain amount of, it produces a certain amount of civilian suffering, but it also politicizes a lot of people. So there's this huge dragnet where lots and lots of Kurdish men and some Kurdish women are arrested, and so women who'd never previously been particularly politicized end up going to the prisons to protest, and they find themselves needing to advocate for their fathers, their sons, their brothers, their husbands, who have been arrested. And this politicizes a lot of women who had never really been all that politicized before. They end up joining the Kurdish national movement, and then some of them end up picking up guns and actually joining the PKK. And then once they're within the organization, they create this really powerful internal dynamic of pushing for greater egalitarianism and pushing for an increase in the rights of women. This is almost exactly what happens within the FARC, right? Which is it's a really interesting parallel. There are votes held within the FARC to allow women in combat roles. It actually happens across 2 votes in 1978 and then in 1982. And women increasingly become politicized as a result of their grievances against the Colombian state. And then they, as they join the movement, once they're actually within the FARC, they start pushing for greater rights for women within the organization. And so there's this sort of interesting, again, dynamic of change from within by women who've actually become part of the organization. What's different with the Colombian case is this is so widespread and such a powerful dynamic that there's actually competition between the FARC and the ELN for who can offer more opportunities for women, because they're both competing with one another to recruit female soldiers. Yeah, it's really interesting. Which I think some of that is it's a side effect of having 2 fairly well established. The FARC's a lot bigger than the ELN, but it's a consequence of having 2 established sizable armed groups, so that would-be recruits actually have something of a choice. But again, there's an entire alphabet soup of Palestinian armed groups, and we don't see a similar bidding war for potential female recruits there.
And these are real fighters, right? This isn't just propaganda. This is the women can fight, and they will get their rights, and they will be treated equally. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. There's actually some evidence that there are lower rates of attrition by female fighters than male fighters. Women are more likely to stick with the organization.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It would be pure speculation if I were to try and guess, but some of it may be that if you join an armed group to get away from a rough family situation, then maybe you have more of an incentive to stick with it, no matter how rough things get. But I don't have a really good answer to that.
We should talk about this, for want of a better word, this kind of fetishization of female fighters in the West.
Yeah, and it's a way of diminishing their military accomplishments, right? It's a way of reducing somebody who's a really capable soldier to a pinup or to a mascot, which is really not okay. It's not okay when it happens to women in the armed forces in this country. Sorry. Well, I'm currently in Germany and I'm a US citizen and you're a Brit. So let's say it's not okay if it happens to women in the armed forces in any of those 3 countries. And it's not okay when it happens to women who are fighting with the YPJ.
I get the thing of, female fighters, that's interesting, because it is. And like you said, throughout all these conflicts, female fighters have actually been a constant we just didn't realize. However, it is fair to say mostly men join up. It doesn't mean the women aren't there, but mostly men join up. But then it just gets twisted into this thing of, I don't know, just they're women. It's but they're fighting ISIS.
Yeah, they're soldiers. I read a really interesting interview, or I guess watched a really interesting interview on the YPG and the YPJ. I'm sure you've seen this. They both have official press, media office YouTube channels, and they They put up all kinds of really interesting stuff. And I was reading an interview with a commander who led one of the main units that was responsible for the defense of Kobane. And one of the things she said was, there's this myth that ISIS are afraid to fight women because they think they won't go to heaven.
Yeah, there's bullshit.
And I can tell you that that's not true, because they came after us and they tried to kill my entire unit, and we stuck it out and we defended our city. So I think this idea that that there's soldiers and then there's female soldiers. I think that's really problematic. And partly because it means we're missing something really important about warfare. If we want to understand the nature of asymmetric conflict, then we have to actually understand the nature of asymmetric conflict, and that means looking at everybody who's involved with it. But it's also, it diminishes the accomplishments, or if atrocities are being committed, it diminishes the culpability of the women who were involved.
You'll love this. It suddenly just popped into my head. I was in, I think, Cizre or Salopia, one of the two cities in southeast Turkey when the conflict was going on. And there was a group of YDGH, so young PKK youth, most of them lads, and they had a female commander. And me, with a Western head on, I was like, oh, that's cool. And I said to the kid, oh, how do you feel about the fact, your commander's a female? Because I thought, you never know, they might be like, oh, I don't like this. And the kid just looked at me, my friend was translating, but he just went, what? It's normal. And these were young guys, young ghetto guys, and it was normal for them.
So one thing that I think would be really interesting as a research project, and I don't know if I will ever have a chance to do this, but all right, if there's any aspiring PhD students listening to this, here you go. Here's your dissertation topic. I would love somebody to do a really careful comparative study of the military performance and internal organization and internal dynamics of the mixed units that fight with the PKK and the all-women's units and the all-men's units in the Syrian Kurdish forces, that is the YPG and YPJ. Because I think there's a really interesting opportunity there, because doctrinally they're pretty similar. They've got very similar ideological roots, and there's at least some evidence, right? I've read testimonies about this, and I've seen interviews suggesting that some of the early officer corps of the YPJ were women who'd had, years of experience fighting with the PKK, but who had Syrian family, who then came back to Syria to help start up the YPJ when ISIS started getting a little bit too close to the Kurdish areas in 2013. So there's a lot of similarity between the two organizations, but they're also organized in somewhat different ways. And I would love to see somebody do some really thoughtful comparison of what some of the differences are between mixed units and segregated units. Because one of the big objections made by people who don't think that combat positions should be open to women is that, oh no, mixed units there's no way that could possibly work. And I think the performance of the PKK suggests otherwise. Whatever issues the PKK has had, I don't think the gender composition of their military units is responsible for those issues. But I think there could be, there's probably a really interesting opportunity to do some really interesting research there.
Absolutely. Ora, where and when can people get hold of your book, and where can people get hold of you and follow your work?
I am on Twitter, Ora Szekely. My last name is unpronounceable in Hungarian. It is spelled Szekely. People can get a hold of the book in early 2019, which is when it's going to be out with Georgetown University Press. It'll be up on their website. There is I believe, an ebook version of the individual chapters as well as the book as a whole, and there's also going to be a paperback version.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you so much for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
So that was Ora Szekely talking about female militants within various irregular conflicts. Please do go to youtube.com/popularfront, subscribe and watch our first documentary. It's already out. It's called Bogside Bonfire. Myself and a young photojournalist from Belfast, a good lad called Conall Kearney, a friend of mine, we went to Derry. We went to the Bogside where the Bloody Sunday Massacre happened. Basically hung out for a couple days with a group of young lads there calling themselves the Bogside Republican Youth. The documentary covers the IRA, the flag burning, the bonfires, and the huge levels of poverty in the Bogside in Derry. So yeah, if that sounds like something you've been to, please do watch it, share it, all of that. We made the doc with absolutely no money, no budget, and we only got about 2 days to shoot. So overall, I think it's alright, it's not too bad. It's had a good reception so far anyway. This episode was sponsored by thedefencepost.com, defense with an S. And if you'd like to support Popular Front and help us carry on making documentaries like Bogside Bonfire and keep the podcast going, go to patreon.com/popularfront. You get all sorts of extras there, like bonus episodes, narrated articles, all sorts of stuff. Thank you very much to the highest tier Patreons. They are Teddy, Emily Molly, Aliame Leroy, Daniel Shearer, Joanne Stocker, Margaret Bowling, Kjetil, Zachary Hinch, Stephen Henderson, LH, Joel Tambusi, Cole Gannon, Ryan Sandercock, Cedar Fenn, and the What Bitcoin Did podcast. And a little bit of Popular Front news, some other stuff we've got coming up. Me and a graphic designer are currently working on making a coffee table book about irregular forces all over the world. It will be very visual, there'll be a lot of graphics, a lot of photos, and basically explanations of various different irregular groups, so guerrilla forces here, there and everywhere. Pictures of their patches, explaining what they were fighting for, what kind of equipment they had. Really looking forward to it. I think it'll be really fun. So when that gets going, I will inform you all, and hopefully you want to buy it at some point. For all things Popular Front, go to popularfront.co or follow me on Twitter. That's at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN is how you spell my surname. Or follow the Popular Front Twitter if you can't be bothered with me. That is at popularfrontco, like the site. Also on Instagram we are popular.front, and like I said before, the youtube.com/popularfront. Please do subscribe, hit that bell thing, because YouTube is an absolutely atrocious platform, it never works properly. Music in this episode, the intro is by an artist called Home, and the outro is by Son of Old, my mate Sam, soundcloud.com/son-of-old.